past 10 years, Dweck and her team at Columbia have studied the effect of praise on students in 20 New York schools. Her seminal work, a series of experiments on 400 fifth graders, paints the picture most clearly. Prior to these experiments, praise for intelligence had been shown to boost children's confidence. But Dweck suspected this would backfire the first moment kids experienced failure or difficulty. Dweck sent 4 female research assistants into New York fifth grade classrooms. The researchers would take a single child out of the classroom for a nonverbal IQ test consisting of a series of puzzles easy enough that all the children would do fairly well. Once the child finished the test, the researchers told each student his score, then gave him a single line of praise. Randomly divided into groups, some were praised for their intelligence. They were told, "You must be smart at this." Other students were praised for their effort. "You must have worked really hard." Why just a single line of praise? "We wanted to see how sensitive children were," Dweck explained. "We had a hunch that one line might be enough to see an effect." Then the students were given a choice of test for the second round. One choice was a test that would be more difficult than the first, but the researchers told the kids that they'd learn a lot from attempting the puzzles. The other choice, Dweck's team explained, was an easy test, just like the first. Of those praised for their effort, 90% chose the harder set of puzzles. Of those praised for their intelligence, a majority chose the easy test. The smart kids took the cop-out. Why did this happen? When we praise children for their intelligence, Dweck wrote in her study summary, we tell them that this is the name of the game. Look smart, don't risk making mistakes. And that's what the fifth graders had done. They'd chosen to look smart and avoid the risk of being embarrassed. In a subsequent round, none of the fifth graders had a choice. The test was difficult, designed for kids 2 years ahead of their grade level. Predictably, everyone failed. But again, the 2 groups of children, divided at random at the study's start, responded differently. Those praised for their effort on the first test assumed they simply hadn't focused hard enough on this test. They got very involved, willing to try every solution to the puzzles, Dweck recalled. Many of them remarked, unprovoked, "This is my favorite test." Not so for those praised for their smarts. They assumed their failure was evidence that they weren't really smart at all. Just watching them, you could see the strain. They were sweating and miserable, Dweck said. Having artificially induced a round of failure, Dweck's researchers then gave fifth graders a final round of tests that were engineered to be as easy as the first round. Those who had been praised for their effort significantly improved on their first score by about 30%. Those who had been told they were smart did worse than they had at the very beginning, by about 20%. Dweck had suspected that praise could backfire, but even she was surprised by the magnitude of the effect. Emphasizing effort gives a child a variable that they can control, she explains. They come to see themselves as in control of their success. Emphasizing natural intelligence takes it out of the child's control, and it provides no good recipe for responding to a failure. In follow-up interviews, Dweck discovered that those who think that innate intelligence is the key to success begin to discount the importance of effort. "I am smart," the kid's reasoning goes. "I don't need to put out effort." Expending effort becomes stigmatized. It's public proof that you can't cut gifts. Repeating her experiments, Dweck found this effective praise on performance held true for students of every socioeconomic class. It hit both boys and girls. The very brightest girls especially, they collapsed the most following failure. Even preschoolers weren't immune to the inverse power of praise. While we might imagine that overpraised kids grow up to be unmotivated softies, the researchers are reporting the opposite consequence. Dweck and others have found that frequently praised children get more competitive and more interested in tearing others down. Image maintenance becomes their primary concern. A raft of very alarming studies, again by Dweck, illustrates this. In one study, students are given 2 puzzle tests. Between the first and the second, they're offered a choice between learning a new puzzle strategy for the second test or finding out how they did compared with other students on the first test. They have only enough time to do one or the other. Students praised for intelligence choose to find out their class rank rather than use the time to prepare. In another study, students get a do-it-yourself report card and are told these forms will be mailed to students at another school. They'll never meet these students and won't know their names. Of the kids praised for their intelligence, 40% lie, inflating their scores. Of the kids praised for effort, few lie. When students transition into junior high, some who'd done well in elementary school inevitably struggle in the larger and more demanding environment. Those who equated their earlier success with their innate ability surmise they've been dumb all along. Their grades never recover because the likely key to their recovery, increasing effort, they view as just further proof of their failure. In interviews, many confess they would seriously consider cheating. Students turn to cheating because they haven't developed a strategy for handling failure. The problem is compounded when a parent ignores a child's failures and insists he'll do better next time. Michigan scholar Jennifer Crocker studies this exact scenario and explains that the child may come to believe failure is something so terrible the family can't acknowledge its existence. A child deprived of the opportunity to discuss mistakes can't learn from them. Brushing aside failure and just focusing on the positive isn't the norm all over the world. A young scholar at the University of Illinois, Dr. Flory Ng, reproduced Dweck's paradigm with 5th graders both in Illinois and in Hong Kong. Ng added an interesting dimension to the experiment. Rather than having the kids take the short IQ tests at their school, the children's mothers brought them to the scholars' offices on campus, both in Urbana-Champaign and at the University of Hong Kong. While the moms sat in the waiting room, half the kids were randomly given the really hard test, where they could get only about half right, inducing a sense of failure. At that point, the kids were given a 5-minute break before the second test, and the moms were allowed into the testing room to talk with their child. On the way in, the moms were told their child's actual raw score and were told to lie, that this score represented a below-average result. Hidden cameras recorded the 5-minute interaction between mother and child. The American mothers carefully avoided making negative comments. They remained fairly upbeat and positive with their child. The majority of the minutes were spent talking about something other than the testing at hand, such as what they might have for dinner. But the Chinese children were likely to hear, "You didn't concentrate when doing it," and "Let's look over your test." The majority of the break was spent discussing the test and its importance. After the break, the Chinese kids' scores on the second test jumped 33%, more than twice the gain of the Americans. The trade-off here would seem to be that the Chinese mothers acted harsh or cruel, but that stereotype may not reflect modern parenting in Hong Kong. Was it quite what Ng saw on the videotapes? While their words were firm, the Chinese mothers actually smiled and hugged their children every bit as much as the American mothers, and were no more likely to frown or raise their voices. But it turns out that the ability to repeatedly respond to failure by exerting more effort, instead of simply giving up, is a trait well studied in psychology. People with this trait, persistence, rebound well and can sustain their motivation through long periods of delayed gratification. Delving into this research, I learned that persistence turns out to be more than a conscious act of will. It's also an unconscious response, governed by a circuit in the brain. Dr. Robert Cloninger at Washington University in St. Louis located this neural network running through the prefrontal cortex and ventral striatum. This circuit monitors the reward center of the brain, and like a switch, it intervenes when there's a lack of immediate reward. When it switches on, it's telling the rest of the brain, don't stop trying, there's DOPA on the horizon. While putting people through MRI scans, Cloninger could see this switch lighting up regularly in some, in others barely at all. So what makes some people wired to have an active circuit? Cloninger has trained rats and mice in mazes to have persistence by carefully not rewarding them when they get to the finish. The key is intermittent reinforcement, says Cloninger. The brain has to learn that frustrating spells can be worked through. A person who grows up getting too frequent rewards will not have persistence because they'll quit when the rewards disappear. That sold me. I thought praise junkie was just an expression, but suddenly it seemed as if I could be setting up my son's brain for an actual chemical need for constant reward. A few scientists theorize that sleep problems during formative years can cause permanent changes in a child's brain structure, damage that one can't sleep off like a hangover. It's even possible that many of the hallmark characteristics of being a tweener and teen, moodiness, depression, and even binge eating, are actually just symptoms of chronic sleep deprivation. When asked if lies are always wrong, 92% of 5-year-olds say yes. And when asked why lies are wrong, most say the problem with lying is you get punished for it. In that sense, young kids process the risk of lying by considering only their own self-protection. It takes years for the children to understand lying on a more sophisticated moral ground. It isn't until age 11 that the majority demonstrate awareness of its harm to others. At that point, 48% say the problem with lying is that it destroys trust, and 22% say it carries guilt. Even then, a third still say the problem with lying is being punished. As an example of how strongly young kids associate lying with punishment, consider this. 38% of 5-year-olds rate profanity as a lie. Why would kids think swearing is a lie? It's because in their minds, lies are the things you say that get you punished or admonished. Swearing gets you admonished. Therefore, swearing is a lie. Increasing the threat of punishment for lying only makes children hyper-aware of the potential personal cost. It distracts the child from learning how his lies impact others. In studies, scholars find that kids who live in threat of consistent punishment don't lie less. Instead, they become better liars at an earlier age, learning to get caught less often. Talwar did a version of the Peking game in Western Africa with children who attend a traditional colonial school. In this school, Talwar described, the teachers would slap the children's heads, hit them with switches, pinch them for anything, forgetting a pencil, getting homework wrong. Sometimes, a good child would be made to enforce the bad kid. While the North American kids usually peak within 5 seconds, children in this school took longer to peak, 35 seconds, even 58 seconds, but just as many peaked. Then they lied and continued to lie. They go for broke because of the severe consequences of getting caught. Even 3-year-olds pretended that they didn't know what the toy was, though they just peeked. They understood that naming the toy was to drop a clue, and the temptation of being right didn't outweigh the risk of being caught. They were able to completely control their verbal leakage, an ability that still eluded 6-year-old Nick. But just removing the threat of punishment is not enough to extract honesty from kids. In yet another variation, Talwar's researchers promised the children, "I will not be upset with you if you peeked. It doesn't matter if you did." Parents try a version of this routinely. But this alone doesn't reduce lying at all. The children are still wary. They don't trust the promise of immunity. They're thinking, "My parent really wishes I didn't do it in the first place. If I say I didn't, that's my best chance of making my parent happy." Meaning, in these decisive moments, they want to know how to get back into your good graces. So it's not enough to say to a 6-year-old, "I will not be upset with you if you peeked, and if you tell the truth you'll be really happy with yourself." That does reduce lying quite a bit. The 6-year-old doesn't want to make himself happy. He wants to make the parent happy. What really works is to tell the child, "I will not be upset with you if you peeked, and if you tell the truth, I will be really happy." This is an offer of both immunity and a clear route back to good standing. Talwar explained this latest finding. Young kids are lying to make you happy, trying to please you. So telling kids that the truth will make a parent happy challenges the kid's original thought that hearing good news, not the truth, is what will please the parent. Dr. Avi Sadeh at Tel Aviv University is one of the dozen or so bigwigs in the field, frequently collaborating on papers with the sleep scholars at Brown University. A couple years ago, Sadeh sent 77 fourth graders and sixth graders home with randomly drawn instructions to either go to bed earlier or stay up later for 3 nights. Each child was given an actigraph, a wristwatch-like device that's equivalent to a seismograph for sleep activity, which allows the researchers to see how much sleep a child is really getting when she's in bed. Using the actigraphy, Sadeh's team learned that the first group managed to get 30 minutes more of true sleep per night. The latter got 31 minutes less of true sleep. After the third night's sleep, a researcher went to the school in the morning to give the children a test of neurobiological functioning. The test, a computerized version of parts of the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children, is highly predictive of current achievement test scores and how teachers rate a child's ability to maintain attention in class. Sadeh knew that his experiment was a big risk. The last situation I wanted to be in was reporting to my grantors, "Well, I deprived the subjects of only an hour, and there was no measurable effect at all, sorry. But can I have some more money for my other experiments?" Sadeh needn't have worried. The effect was indeed measurable and sizable. The performance gap caused by an hour's difference in sleep was bigger than the gap between a normal fourth grader and a normal sixth grader, which is another way of saying that a slightly sleepy sixth grader will perform in class like a mere fourth grader. A loss of 1 hour of sleep is equivalent to the loss of 2 years of cognitive maturation and development, Sadeh explained. Everyone's heard that it damages children to be witness to their parents fighting, especially the kind of venomous screaming matches that escalate into worse. But what about plain old everyday conflict? Over the last decade, that question has been the specialty of the University of Notre Dame's Dr. E. Mark Cummings. Cummings realized every child sees parents and caregivers carping at each other over such banalities as who forgot to pick up the dry cleaning, pay the bills, or whose turn it is to drive the carpool. In studies where Cummings has parents make a note of every argument, no matter how small or large, the typical married couple was having about 8 disputes each day, according to the moms. According to the dads, it was slightly less. Spouses express anger to each other 2 or 3 times as often as they show a moment of affection to each other. And while parents might aspire to shielding their kids from their arguing, the truth is that children are witness to it 45% of the time. Children appear to be highly attuned to the quality of their parents' relationship. Cummings has described children as emotional Geiger counters. In one study, Cummings found that children's emotional well-being and security are more affected by the relationship between the parents than by the direct relationship between the parent and child. So are parents distressing their children with every bicker? Not necessarily. In Cummings' elaborate experiments, he stages arguments for children to witness and monitors how they react, sometimes taking saliva samples to measure their stress hormone, cortisol. In some cases, 2 actors go at it. In others, the mother too is a confederate. While waiting with the child, the mother gets a phone call, ostensibly from the father, and she begins arguing with him over the phone. Her lines are mostly scripted. In other variations of this experiment, the child just watches a videotape of 2 adults arguing, and she is asked to imagine the on-screen characters are her parents. In one study, a third of the children reacted aggressively after witnessing the staged conflict. They shouted, got angry, or punched a pillow. But in that same study, something else happened which eliminated the aggressive reaction in all but 4% of the children. What was this magical thing? Letting the child witness not just the argument, but the resolution of the argument. When the videotape was stopped mid-argument, it had a very negative effect. But if the child was allowed to see the contention get worked out, it calmed him. We varied the intensity of the arguments, and that didn't matter, recalled Cummings. The arguments can become pretty intense, and yet if it's resolved, kids are okay with it. Most kids were just as happy at the conclusion of the session as they were when witnessing a friendly interaction between parents. What this means is that parents who pause mid-argument to take it upstairs to spare the children might be making the situation far worse, especially if they forget to tell their kids, hey, we worked it out. Cummings has also found that when couples have arguments entirely away from the kids might not have seen any of it, but are still well aware of it, despite not knowing any specifics. Cummings recently has shown that being exposed to constructive marital conflict can actually be good for children if it doesn't escalate, insults are avoided, and the dispute is resolved with affection. This improves their sense of security over time and increases their prosocial behavior at school as rated by teachers. Cummings noted, resolution has to be sincere, not manipulated for their benefit, or they'll see through it. Kids learn a lesson in conflict resolution. The argument gives them an example of how to compromise and reconcile, a lesson lost for the child spared witnessing an argument. The vast majority of behavioral scientists think of prosocial and antisocial behavior as being at opposite ends of a single dimension, explains University of Kansas professor Patricia Hawley. To me, that oversimplifies the complexity of human behavior. In the canon of child development, it's long been taken as gospel that a truly socially competent child is non-aggressive. Hawley questions that orientation. Hawley studies kids from preschool up through high school. She looks specifically at how one kid makes another do his bidding, whether it's through kind, prosocial behavior or antisocial acts, threats, violence, teasing. Contrary to those who expected kids high in prosocial behavior to be low in antisocial acts, and vice versa, she finds that the same kids are responsible for both, the good and the bad. They are simply in the middle of everything, or in the words of another researcher, they're just socially busy. Holly calls the children who successfully use both prosocial and antisocial tactics to get their way bi-strategic controllers. These kids see that when used correctly, kindness and cruelty are equally effective tools of power. The trick is achieving just the right balance and the right timing. Those who master alternating between the two strategies become attractive to other children rather than repellent because they bring so much to the party. Not only are they popular, they're well liked by kids, and by teachers too, who rate them as being agreeable and well-adjusted. Holly's data suggests that at least 1 in 10 children fits the bi-strategic description. But inspired by her approach, several other scholars have done similar analyses. Their subsequent findings suggest that the proportion is even higher, around 1 in 6. An infant need a live human speaker to learn language from? Why are babies learning not from the audio track of a baby DVD, while their language isn't impaired by exposure to regular TV? The evidence suggests one factor is that baby DVDs rely on disembodied audio voiceovers, unrelated to the abstract imagery of the video track. Meanwhile, grown-up television shows live actors, usually close up. Kids can see their faces as they talk. Studies have repeatedly shown that seeing a person's face makes a huge difference. Babies learn to decipher speech partly by lip reading. They watch how people move their lips and mouths to produce sounds. One of the first things that babies must learn, before they can comprehend any word meanings, is when one word ends and another begins. Without segmentation, an adult's words probably sound about the same to an infant as does his own babbling. At 7.5 months, babies can segment the speech of people they see speaking. However, if the babies hear speech while looking at an abstract shape instead of a face, they can't segment the sounds. The speech, once again, is just endless gibberish. Even for adults, seeing someone's lips as he speaks is the equivalent of a 20 decibel increase in volume. When a child sees someone speak and hears his voice, there are 2 sensory draws, 2 simultaneous events, both telling the child to pay attention to this single object of interest, this moment of human interaction. The result is that the infant is more focused, remembers the event, and learns more. Contrast that to the disconnected voiceovers and images of the baby videos. The sensory inputs don't build on each other. Instead, they compete. Would baby DVDs work better if they showed human faces speaking? Possibly. But there's another reason, a more powerful reason, why language learning can't be left to DVDs. Video programming can't interact with the baby, responding to the sounds she makes. On average, the children in Tamis Lamonda's study said their first words just before they were 13 months old. By 18 months, The average toddler had 50 words in her vocabulary, was combining words together, and was even using language to talk about the recent past. But there was great variability within this sample, with some tots hitting those milestones far earlier, others far later. The variable that best explained these gaps was how often a mom rapidly responded to her child's vocalizations and explorations. The toddlers of high responders were a whopping 6 months ahead of the toddlers of low responders. They were saying their first word at 10 months and reaching the other milestones by 14 months. Remember, the families in this sample were all well off, so all the children were exposed to robust parent vocabularies. All the infants heard lots of language. How often a mother initiated a conversation with her child was not predictive of the language outcomes. What mattered was, if the infant initiated, whether the mom responded. Parent, keen to improve his response rate, might make the mistake of over-reinforcing less resonant sounds when a baby is otherwise ready to progress, thereby slowing development. This would reward a baby for immature sounds, making it too easy for the baby to get attention. The extent to which parents, in a natural setting, should phase out responses to immature sounds and become more selective in their response is thus far unknown. One of the ways parents help infants is by doing what's called object labeling, telling them, "That's your stroller, see the flower, and look at the moon." Babies learn better from object labeling when the parent waits for the baby's eyes to naturally be gazing at the object. The technique is especially powerful when the infant both gazes and vocalizes, or gazes and points. Ideally, the parent isn't intruding or directing the child's attention. Instead, he's following the child's lead. When the parent times the label correctly, the child's brain associates the sound with the object. Parents screw this up in two ways. First, they intrude rather than let the child show some curiosity and interest first. Second, they ignore what the child is looking at and instead take their cues from what they think the child was trying to say. The baby, holding a spoon, might say, "Buh, buh," and the zealous parent thinks, "He just said bottle, he wants his bottle," and echoes to the child, "Bottle, you want your bottle? I'll get you your bottle." Inadvertently, the parent just crisscrossed the baby, teaching him that a spoon is called bottle. Some parents, in Goldstein and Schwad's research, make these mismatches of speech 30% of the time,